Good afternoon to everyone joining us today, and happy NAIDOC Week. My name is Professor Michael McDaniel. I'm a Wiradjuri man and Pro-Vice Chancellor Indigenous Leadership and Engagement at UTS. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar with our special guest, Ms. Phillipa McDermott, and our MC, Mr. Dan Conifer. I'd like to commence our proceedings by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the UTS City campus now stands. Similarly, I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. Today's webinar is brought to you as part of a webinar series titled UTS Illuminated, celebrating the achievements of successful alumni who've been recipients of the UTS 2020 Alumni Award. A warm welcome to you all, and in particular our award recipients, their guests, and the UTS alumni with us today, whether you're joining us from Sydney or somewhere else around the world. And now to introduce our 2020 UTS Alumni Award recipient, Ms. Phillipa McDermott. A proud Waka Waka and Manajali woman, Philippa started her journey with UTS with her graduation with a Bachelor of Arts in Communication. Philippa has held several roles throughout her career, including being a broadcaster, manager of the economic development stream of the Commonwealth Government's Indigenous Employment Program New South Wales, and media manager for both the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission New South Wales and the Department of Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales. In addition to this, she was a previous chair of Koori Radio and the board of Media Ring. She's currently the chair of Bangarra Dance Theatre, Australia's premier Indigenous dance company. Since 2013, Philippa has been head of Indigenous employment and diversity at the ABC. And under her leadership, I'm very pleased to share with you that the national broadcaster has for the first time met and gone beyond its 3% Indigenous employment target, a wonderful achievement. Philippa is passionate about truth-telling. She's equally passionate about Indigenous employment and ensuring that as many Indigenous and diverse people are working in the media industry as possible, so that they can tell their own stories in their own narrative and on their own terms. Philippa believes that through employment and economic development, First Nations people can truly become independent. Above all, she has lived a life, both professionally and personally, determined to have a positive impact on society. She's an outstanding person, a dear friend of mine, and a role model to many in our community. We're absolutely delighted that she'll be speaking with us today and sharing her story. Welcome to you, Philippa.
Thank you, Michael. Wow, what a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's an honour to be here today and to have been awarded my award. I never expected it, and it was a beautiful surprise to me. So thank you so much for thinking of me, UTS. And I suppose really that's where it all started for me, was at UTS in a lot of ways. So I have a lot to thank the university for.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Philippa. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I'd like to welcome another UTS Indigenous alumni to the conversation, Mr. Dan Conifer. Dan is a political reporter with the ABC. He graduated from UTS with a Bachelor of Communications in Journalism and has graciously agreed to serve as our Master of Ceremonies today. And welcome to you too, Dan.
Thanks, Professor McDaniel.
So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Dan, to guide us from here on.
Thank you, and thank you, Philippa, and congratulations. Firstly, I'll acknowledge the Turrbal and Niagara people of the Brisbane area, where I'm coming to you from today, and where I've been preparing for today's proceedings as well. Before we get underway, a few house rules, as always with these kind of things. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the UTS YouTube channel. after today, and we'll share the link details over the coming days if you wanted to share that around your networks or tune in again. The format for today is a presentation by Philippa, followed by about a 20-minute discussion between the pair of us, and then the remaining time we'll use for some questions from the audience and discussion between you and the audience and Philippa, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. But again, as usual with these Zoom webinars and such this year, no guarantees that we will. So please don't take it personally if we don't get to your question. But yes, please send through those questions in the Q&A chat box in your Zoom control panel. You can see the instructions there, how to find that if you're a new Zoomer, unlikely in November of 2020, but there it is, the Q&A button in the middle there on the slide. So that's where to put your questions. And thank you to those who've already submitted questions when registering. Before we get into the Q&A elements of today though, let's hand over to Philippa and hear from her about her story.
Well, thank you, Dan. Well, firstly, of course, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Bidigal land today. I'm actually at Kamay near Botany Bay. It's a beautiful day here in Sydney. I'd like to thank the elders, past and present, from this beautiful place and acknowledge our emerging leaders. Also acknowledge wherever you are today that you're on Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander land. I can't really see who's on the webinar, but I acknowledge, you know, your cultural authority from any of the lands that you are from there from around Australia, and also to any of our international alumni and guests, and acknowledge that wherever you are, you're probably on Indigenous land as well. Thank you, Dan. It's going to be fun having this conversation with you. Dan and I work together, in case you're not aware, and we're on the Bonner Committee together. So we have had a lot of conversations recently around the media and our role after Black Lives Matter matters, and we will talk about that, absolutely. And that was part of what I wanted to talk about today, and to see if, you know, things have changed in the media since George Floyd's death, and if not, why not? But firstly, I thought I'd just give you a bit of background about myself and how I ended up at UTS, and then Dan and I can have a yarn. And I think it's better with these kind of things for people to do an interview style thing as well. That's why I was just thrilled when Dan put his hand up to do this, because I think it just is a bit more interactive as well, and of course then with your questions. So without further ado, I will start. So I didn't actually finish high school. I'm a Mulunjali and Waka Waka woman, and that's not why I didn't finish high school. So Mulunjali is my grandfather's country in Tweed Heads, from Bow Desert down to the Tweed. And my grandmother's country is Waka Waka in central Queensland, the Burnett region. And I grew up between Tweed Heads and Sydney, mainly in Sydney, but always going in holidays and what have you to Tweed, not so much to my grandmother's country, but mainly in Tweed. So I got to know my grandfather's country really well. I grew up in my high schooling was in the 80s, early 80s. And so it wasn't particularly encouraged I wasn't particularly encouraged to go to uni, although it was mentioned. School never really mentioned it very much, and people often left in year 10 and took up trades, or, you know, if they went on to year 12, university wasn't a huge thing. So I ended up finishing in year 11 for a number of reasons. I had a car accident that I was in and out of hospital for, and school didn't really suit me. And then I went traveling overseas, and I met a lot of people my age. So I was probably about 19, went for a couple of years. And I realized then that all of those kids who were my age, from whether they were American or European, knew so much about their history of their country, and they could talk about their political systems, and they had opinions, and they actually, they had opinions about their country and what was happening. And we didn't really ever learn anything like that when I went to school. There was no civics in school, and I was kind of embarrassed, actually, to tell you the truth. And in fact, when I ended up finishing my trip and then living in England, as you do for, the kind of the gap year thing, I actually realised I knew more about English history than I knew about my own history. I knew about my community and my Aboriginal history to a degree, but I didn't know the bigger picture of how we fit in with, the last 250 years of Australia. So it kind of drove me to want to find out more. And so when I finally finished that trip, I came back, and as a mature age student, I finished high school, went to Randwick TAFE, did year 11 and 12 in 1 year, and then did a bridging course to get into UTS. And I remember writing my application, and it was down to the last day, and I was still writing it like almost the last hour, like such a journalist, and I didn't even know it then, like having a deadline. And, running over to UTS to get it in, and then I got in, and so I wanted to study politics because I needed to know how Australia worked. I had no clue. I had no franchise. I'd never really voted, even though you're supposed to. And so I thought, oh God, I have to understand how this country works. So I did, my degree was in social and political theory and journalism. And so the politics was to understand how the country worked, because the journalism was to try and understand why people had depicted and represented Aboriginal people, the media had represented Aboriginal people the way they had, because that wasn't my experience, what I was seeing. And I was it always made me so angry about the way we were represented. And I thought, well, I'm going to do something about that. So anyway, I went to UTS, and just quickly, I was told about Jumbunna. But back in the day, so that would have been like 1996, maybe even 93. It was on the 15th floor of not even of the tower building, and then you had to go across go through a service door, walk across a roof with no railing on any of the side to get to the other building to get into Jumbunna. And I didn't know that until Tom Evans found me in the common room, which was in the Bond Marsh building, working on the computer. And I thought that was Jumbunna. But anyway, once I found Jumbunna, well, he showed me where it was, and I still got lost about 10 times before actually figuring out exactly how to get there. I noticed these days it's in a very swanky place. I started to really make connections with people, and that's where I got involved in radio with 2SCR, and then met friends like Kathy Craigie, Darlene Johnson, and people who were doing media there then. Kathy introduced me to Koori Radio, and I just absolutely loved the idea that we had our own platform. And so I was at Koori Radio for a long time, off and on, 10 years. I was the acting general manager. I was the chair for a while. I was a broadcaster, and wrangled quite a few friends to come in as well. It was pretty chaotic, and it ran on the smell of an oily rag, which I think it still does. But it was another way that we could get our message across. So while I was studying journalism and politics, the reality was dawning on me that this is going to be a lot harder than what I thought, to actually kind of get into the media and to start changing perspectives. Once I understood the entrenched and historical racism that was the history of Australia, the enormity of the challenge actually began to dawn on me and all my colleagues and all my students, friends. And so we all went about trying to change those perspectives in different ways. Some people became filmmakers, some people became, you know, journalists, some PR and what have you. So I was dead set on becoming a journalist, but I actually got offered a job while I was a poor broke student to do media for the then Office of Aboriginal Affairs. And that then I got the job while I was still at uni, and that then saw me go to the dark side, what journalists call the dark side, which is the kind of media, PR, comms side of journalism. And then I never really went in the other direction back to being a journalist. So so that's how I kind of ended up in media. But you could still look at changing perspectives, and I kind of killed two birds with one stone with that job, because I was working in politics. So I was actually understanding the practicality of politics as opposed to the theory, which is very different as well. So of course, studying social and political theory, and then actually working at the Office of Aboriginal Affairs, and then with the Minister's Office, and seeing how it really works in reality was pretty eye-opening. And then also, you know, trying to kind of look at how we could get messages out. And why weren't journalists interested in what we had to say? You know, I mean, it was near impossible to get a good news story up. And that would have been in 1996, between 96 and 98. There was a lot of stuff happening. It was after the Royal Commission. But the media just were not interested in any good news we had to say. All they were interested in was conflict. And I think that's still the case, but things have changed a little bit, you know. And then native title. Then when the native title decision came down, I looked back at some of the press from then, and then have recently spoken to some journalists who were in Parliament House at the time when that decision came down in 1992. And some of the examples that they were giving me about the racism that was just absolutely blatant on the front page of every newspaper, and in the gallery at the time, in the press gallery in Canberra, were that one of the journos, Michelle Ainsworth, in our Canberra office, told me she was doing a story on it, and a politician took the microphone out of her hand and when she was doing her piece to camera, and said, your backyard will be taken if this continues. And of course, that's where Pauline Hanson came from. So I suppose trying to get anything positive into the media when those big challenges and when those big issues come up, and even after that, has been a real challenge for us. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, Australia's inability to talk about race in a civil manner without feeling defensive or without feeling guilty to some degree. And it's only been more recently that I think, and especially after Black Lives Matter, that we've been able to crack open the door to talk about race and racism in the portrayal of people, and the way that the media represents and covers stories like that. And I think it's really only been because of what happened in the States that I know from my experience now that I've been able to have conversations with people with journalists about how race is reported. So I've kind of skipped a lot, I suppose, from where I started. to this topic, but I'm just conscious of the time. So after Aboriginal Affairs, I then went to work at ATSIC, which was, you know, again, trying to do the same kind of thing. You know, I had literally had stand-up fights with EPs and journalists trying to get our message across or get them to talk to any of our commissioners about things that were happening from an Aboriginal perspective. And, you know, it was really only around kind of in the last, well, since from about 2000, when the corroboree and the march across the bridge, and then in 2008 the apology, I think, started to break down barriers that it's not actually going to cost you money to tell the truth and talk about Aboriginal Australia in a positive way. We're not going to sue you. We're not going to litigate against you, which is of course the, you know, the line that Howard was peddling. So things have slowly changed. But has, you know, the media kept up with societal changes? You know, I think slowly, but that's probably where I should leave it, and maybe Dan and I can start the conversation.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, and you've touched on a little bit of this here, but the change over the decades in terms of reporting of Indigenous affairs, in terms of the actual inclusion of Indigenous voices in stories in Indigenous affairs, how's that changed over the decades that you've seen it? Slow change, as you say, but yeah, how and why has that come about?
Well, I think now there's a lot more Indigenous people in the media industry, so that is one way, and they're not necessarily giving their perspective, they're reporting on stories but with a different perspective, so they're not so that has definitely broken down a lot of barriers, but also I think because of societal change, I think reconciliation has helped in that corporate Australia has actually taken up the mantle to shame governments. And, you know, I'm not saying it's a perfect, you know, situation, obviously it's not, but, you know, that they're prepared to back Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices and people and give us some franchise in our country through employment and what have you, has kind of, it started to break down barriers. And I think, you know, our younger people are making the point that that you can't talk about these things without the perspective of the people you're talking about. It's just not acceptable anymore.
You mentioned Black Lives Matter being a turning point or a tipping point in terms of how Indigenous affairs and Indigenous stories are covered in Australia. Firstly, that's you know, if that's true, that's it's quite sad that it had to be something from outside of our own country that led to change in Australia. But what shifts have you seen in public sentiment, appetite for stories, audience feedback since the Black Lives Matter movement really started to become a big force and a big news story globally?
Well, I mean, that movement did start along, you know, 5 years before George Floyd's passing, but because of the, you know, because of the coverage of George Floyd's death, and you're right, Dan, to say that it is sad that it took that kind of thing to happen overseas when it's been happening here for 250 years. But I think that it is the safety of something happening overseas that has cracked open the door for us to have the conversation here, because we have then been able to say, well, it actually happens here too. So instead of us saying, this is happening here right now, you know, what are you going to do about it? It's the perspective is shifted that it happens over there and we can have a conversation about that. Well, it actually happens here too. So let's have that same conversation here. And I think it is less threatening to journalists to have the conversation like that, instead of having the topic that is happening right here, right now, that there are deaths in custody every day, because somehow we're more responsible for that if we have to report on it and look at it just through that lens. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I mean, you say there has been a shift, and there have been improvements over the past 5 years, and certainly since the untimely and tragic death of George Floyd in the United States. But going forward from here, what's your hope for the future of how diverse stories, Indigenous stories, are being told and being reported?
Well, I think newsrooms have to come to realise their shortcomings, and I know a lot of them do, but they just there is casual racism in every newsroom, and if not casual, probably beyond that, just racism in every newsroom in this country, and probably beyond. At what pace those newsrooms actually accept that has happened and that they need to do something about changing that. And I know that we're looking at that at the ABC. I know, that SBS is, and is really, it's the mirror, Dan, that needs to be held up. And like, it's ironic, right, that we're seeking the truth by being journalists and covering things like that, but we actually have to start being true and honest to ourselves, and it's institutional. So the things that, so these institutions, whether it's Channel 9, that is an institution, 7, 10, us, they're all institutions. And so it's that institutional racism that needs to be broken down, and it goes from who we employ to how we cover things, from what perspective, whether we even cover things or not, how we cover a demonstration. Are we looking at it from the demonstrator's point of view or from a government and police perspective? They're the things. And so how do we kind of start changing that narrative is by employing more people. Is by employing more Indigenous people and people from diverse backgrounds, because they do have a different perspective. So they're not always going to report the protest from the, police kind of government line. They're going to look at it from a different lens and say, and explain why the people are protesting. And quite often peaceful protests would even be covered as, looking for some element of angst or what have you. So they're the kind of things that we've got to be vigilant about, that kind of reporting. And the way we do that is by getting more people in. And don't forget for me to tell everybody about our jobs that we've got coming up too.
You could do that now if you like. We could take a little ad break at 12:28 p.m. and you can spruik those roles. Okay,
well, that's one of the reasons why I'm on here too, right? Is because if there are any students, we can't see who's kind of participating, but if there are any students, Indigenous or non-Indigenous students, looking to get a foot in the door, we have 8 traineeships up on our careers website right now, across regional, rural and capital cities. So they are, so there's 2 capital city and 6 regional and rural cadetships. So even if you live in a capital city, but you're keen, you can apply for a cadetship somewhere else. I mean, you'll have to find your own way to get to that rural place, but it's a great opportunity. And there are also quite a few other jobs on there, and will be. So keep an eye out. I will try and get the link up, but I don't know if I can do that while I'm talking. I should have organised that before.
You punch in ABC Careers into your favourite search engine, you'll be able to navigate there. Who said you don't get advertising with the national broadcaster? Thank you, Philippa. Back to normal transmission. But on a similar theme.
Sorry?
I said, on a similar theme though, how do we, how do you think, we as a media industry attract more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders into our profession?
Well, I'm going to ask you that too, Dan, but and I'm going to ask you those questions too, because you're actually on the ground doing all of that. But, well, look, I think there's a couple of challenges there, right? If you're getting the marks to do a comms degree at UTS, you're getting the marks to do a whole bunch of other stuff that pays a whole lot more. So there's that. But also, I think we don't see ourselves represented in the media enough, and we don't see our views reflected and our perspectives reflected that well. It's kind of not really a welcoming place, right, for people to come. But that is changing, right? Like, I've got to say, since over the last 5 or more years, we've got more than double the amount of people at the ABC now and into storytelling. So whether that's television, journalism like news, like Dan's in, regional and local radio. So of course, news isn't, we've been kind of focusing on news journalism today, but it's also storytelling across, all of those other platforms. And I think that's where we're starting to get traction. Obviously, what we're doing with TV, with Redfern now, The Heights, Total Control, all of those kind of shows, like we are now being represented equally and normally, not as kind of the other, across our screens. So that's in movies and on TV, so that is making a difference and wanting people to actually become practitioners, whether filmmakers or what have you. I think journalism's taking a little bit longer, but other types of, digital, using our digital platforms, we've got a lot of people wanting to get into that space as well. And if you are looking for a job in the media, you totally need to be, up to date with all your digital skills. That is like, a no-brainer now. But yeah, so there's other ways and platforms. There's books and radio and podcasts and stuff like that. And plus social media, man, we are like all over that, right? Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people, we love it. So we're actually getting our voice out there, and maybe people don't think they need to get into, legacy media like, the ABC, because they've got their own voice. What do you think?
I think that's taking everything that you said, but I think it's also worth particularly given that this is a UTS event and UTS done well by both of us. Credit to the university sector for really doing a great job at recruiting and getting Indigenous people into unis where that was a foreign space until relatively recently in our history. And then the challenge, I think, for organisations like the ABC and then our friends in commercial media and really all businesses and organisations is then, the unis having done such a great job to get young people or mature age students in and studying whatever they want to study and making that pathway into uni as easy as possible. Then for organisations, corporates, not-for-profits and government orgs like ours to then make that pathway from university into the workforce as easy a pathway, and reaching out to, climbing across level 15 to get the jump to scaling those heights to go and steal some of those students that are just about to graduate. But those are just a few thoughts. Probably about 5 more minutes for our Q&A, Philippa, and then we'll get to a few of the questions that are coming in.
I'm going to ask you a question, Dan.
Hold that thought. And so if you've got any questions, please shoot them through, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can between now and 2 o'clock for probably most people if they're on the eastern seaboard watching this, or 1 o'clock in the afternoon for me here in Queensland. So about 25 minutes to go before we wrap up. Philippa, what are the key challenges do you think for our mob, and how would you address address these.
Key challenges media-wise?
Media-wise or broader than the media.
Oh God. Yeah, well, we've got a lot of challenges. I think racism and poverty are two of our biggest challenges. Poverty, absolutely, because you know, poverty stops you from having a place to live, from participating, from having any agency. So I think poverty is one of our biggest challenges, and of course that goes to health and, you know, to everything. Obviously, education is a major key to that, and you know, those doors are so open now. I mean, I think there was probably 30 people in my graduating year, maybe less, or we didn't all graduate at the same time, but I think there was only around 30 of us, and you know, maybe graduating over kind of 3 or 4 years while I was there in comms. I mean, there were people doing other things, maybe not even, and then they all didn't do journalism. So back to the question, one of the biggest challenge I think is poverty, but to break that cycle is education, which of course UTS is absolutely helping break down those barriers. As my grandmother said, and this is, you know, education's been such a huge thing in our family, was that, you know, and my mother said this too, they can take away your language, they can try and take away your culture, they can try and take away your land, but no one can take away your education, right? So once it's in there, you know, it's there to stay. So yeah, absolutely driving that home. And I think challenges for the media is for us to actually get more people in there. So look, Dan, why did you want to become a journalist, and how did you become a journalist?
You got that in there. I was going to try and skate away from being on the other end of the question.
Yeah, I still know how to ask the questions.
That journalism degree at UTS served you well. How and why? Let's start with the how. Thanks to Sydney's Koori Radio, which is the Indigenous community radio station in Sydney, when I was at high school, and sort of wanted to see what this whole media thing was about. I'm not sure if you were still there on the board at that stage. You might have been, Philippa, down at Marrickville in the inner west of Sydney, in the old Marrickville Hospital there. It's got a fancy new building in Redfern now, but that's where it was, and knocked on the door down there, and the then general manager, Brad Cook, let me come and volunteer on during school holidays, because I was still at school at that stage, and then gave me a show to host, and really that was helped me get into uni, then make the move over to from community media to sort of mainstream media with SBS and the ABC, and been with the ABC since then, since studying at UTS. The why question, I mean, the answer's similar to yours, really. Got to need to shake things up. Got to change the narratives, change the thinking within newsrooms, within news organisations, and have conversations with people that can make a difference. And there's plenty of different ways to do that, and the media is one of those. So,
is it harder than what you thought it was going to be?
The last one, Philippa. The last one. We've got to go.
I'm interested.
We'll go to our Q&A from the audience in a second, and thank you for Daryl and Jackie and others for sending your questions through. Sorry, I forgot yours, Philippa. What was that?
Is it harder to get those perspectives across than you thought it was going to be?
No, probably about the same amount of challenge, knowing that as with a lot of things, we're entering spaces that haven't had a lot of Indigenous people in them in the past, and that you know, it is a challenge, that it's a big sort of, you know, for us as Indigenous people in different workplaces and different spaces, you know, you're educating your non-Indigenous brothers and sisters and colleagues a lot of the time when you are trying to drive that change. And that is, you know, sometimes might be frustrating, sometimes mightn't be easy, but you know, you do it because we're all pushing, you know, we're all pushing forward in different ways. So yeah, probably about the same amount of challenge, I would say.
Yeah.
Lastly, before we go to Q&As from our audience, and yeah, keep shooting those in, please. What message, Philippa, do you hope to impart to young alumni and students who might be tuning in?
Well, look, I would really encourage, if you want to get into the media or you've been thinking about it and you might be sitting on the fence, there is a place for you. And in fact, there's more acceptance now than there ever has been, and need for you to come and join the ABC or whatever media organisation or whatever kind of content making platform that you want to tell your stories from. And it is needed now more than ever, right? And I think the opportunity is open now more than ever for your perspectives and your stories to be told, and audiences love it, right? And the thing that media is always about is about the audience. How are we going to get more audience? How are we going to get new audience? What about this audience? What about... So the more perspectives we have, obviously, the better it's going to be for our audience, and we'll bring more audience in. So please really consider it. You don't have to be a journalist. You could be on radio, you could be in TV, you could be in film, on digital, whatever. But your voice, it is welcome now, probably more than ever.
Let's go to some questions from people tuning in, and thank you for sending those in. And if there's anything that Philippa or I say that you want to sort of follow up on or hear more about, just drop us a note like you've been doing. Let's go to a question, Philippa, from Mark Benny. Mark, thanks for sending this one in. And he says, the ABC and SBS have made some changes and commitments, and then goes on to ask, when are the commercial networks going to step up, and who's working on them to make that happen?
Well, Dan, you could probably answer this as well. I think Channel 9, obviously having Brooke Boney on breakfast and employing her, and there are other people that work there in the background, are making a start. I was on an organisation called Media Ring, which was trying to engage 7, 9 and 10 to get a wrap, which has really been a big focus for both us and SBS as to how to go about trying to embed Indigenous cultural perspectives into our organisations. So I think that organisation's still trying to make that happen. Obviously, we're not there yet, but the other thing they're doing, as opposed to employing people, is they're actually showing content, right? So they are showing, so Channel 10's taken up one of Larissa Barent's new projects. And so if they're not employing people, which should be the next step, but, you know, there's a bit of toing and froing about, you know, the amount of jobs in commercial at the moment. They're at least showing the content. What do you think?
Yeah, no, would agree with that, and note that there are some steps that are being made by some of these organisations. Channel 10, for example, has a special NAIDOC Week program on at this week, and the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age have Indigenous Affairs reporters in those newspapers, I believe supported by the Judith Nielsen Institute for Journalism, and even the West Australian newspaper, which has been criticised in the past for its coverage now, has an Indigenous reporter on staff over there, and has been giving her a good run from what I've seen. So, as always with these things, steps, perhaps not as fast as we'd like, but steps nevertheless. Let's go to Daryl Nelson and his question. Daryl, thank you for shooting this one through. What do you believe is the best short-term pathway towards improved Indigenous representation, more Indigenous media or content startups, or more Indigenous people working in mainstream media. Yeah, and a short-term pathway is what Daryl's interested in.
Well, I think creating, I think having, using platforms that are not big legacy platforms like ours, like the ABC, I mean, that's one way to do that, but getting your content out there, looking at Indigenous media like NITV, Koori Radio, or film, short film, I think those are other pathways for representation. So it kind of makes up the whole. We're gonna, I think, you know, we're doing bits and pieces that we can across news and what have you at the ABC, but I think, you know, our own media and growing our own media is a really important thing for us to do, and making that as awesome as we can possibly do that, is really important. So investing in Indigenous media, I think is a kind of quicker path.
A question, I think a couple of people had a similar question here. So thanks Jackie, and thanks Mayra for this one. Did you both have mentors who offered you life-changing advice that you've carried ever since? And do you remember what the advice was?
Well, what about you, Dan?
So you can have a think and and ponder your answer. I've been lucky to have a lot of people who've been mentors and who've sponsored me at various stages. And I can't think of a single piece of advice, but I think just having people, and this is in a professional sort of context that I'm talking about, but people that you know, believe in you, can see your potential, even though you mightn't be there yet, and then willing to you know, invest until you do reach that potential or somewhere near it. Just having people like that are willing to you know, to engage in that process has been something that I've really benefited from. And yeah, just people that are really willing to back you and willing to sponsor you and talk you up and be referees and all of that good stuff. Philippa, how about you?
Yeah, I haven't really, I think I had a formal mentor once, but I've had a lot of people in my life who I have worked with or bounced off. So one of the most amazing people was a guy called John Yufong. Was an Aboriginal journalist, one of the first Aboriginal journalists, and a most excellent writer. And I know that Carla Grant had won something at the Kennedy Awards that was named after John. So one of the awards there was named after John, and he was such a larger than life character. Oh my goodness, he was an incredible, but a brilliant writer. So he told me to learn to write. I probably still haven't mastered that skill, but that was the kind of the start. And writing really can take you anywhere if you can write well. So that was one piece, because that translates to, you know, to digital, to radio. You still got to write scripts, to TV. You got to write scripts for news. You got to write scripts, you know, for print, obviously, etc. So you know, learn how to write and write well. Was a piece of advice that I got.
A question from Jackie, and thanks for sending this one through, Jackie. Who would you invite over for dinner to have a meal with and a conversation with, if you could invite anybody in the world, and you can pick more than one as well?
Oh. Okay. Well, I think I'd like to, like, some of my ancestors. So like, I never met my great grandmother. Well, I did, but I was like 7 and really only once or twice. My grandmother lived to 98, and she was just an incredible force of nature, and did so much for our family. And her mother before her taught her everything. So I would like to have met a few of my ancestors and maybe just seen what life was like for them and what made them the people that they are, that make me the person that I am. I mean, obviously my mother and father and my immediate family that I know, but I can feel them, you know, from way back then. I know they're here. So, oh, I'm going to tear up. Yeah, so maybe them.
Yeah, good answer. And I'd absolutely echo that. Yeah, particularly, my great grandmother, the same situation. I only had her for, too few years. And that was sort of when, dementia sadly starts kicking in as well. So good to, wind back the clock and, have Big Nan and Big Pop around and a few others potentially. So lovely answer, Philippa.
I'd love to be in a time machine. I would just love to go back to that station where they were, and just before colonization and invasion as well. Like, that would be amazing. Yeah, and that's we're talking about perspectives that are that we view history through. I think that's one where when non-Indigenous people came to various parts of the country is something that's always seen from the non-Indigenous perspective, but it would be absolutely. Hey, look, there's a movie for us, Dan. We can write a movie. Don't anyone take that idea, okay? From Aurora Murphy, thanks Aurora. What do you think is the role of Indigenous languages in Indigenous and mainstream media? Aurora says that they rarely hear any Indigenous languages spoken here in New South Wales or in the media. Well, you've come to the right place, Aurora, because our Elevate Reconciliation Action Plan, so you need to tune into the ABC, is all about language. So you had to have a thought leadership piece about how you're going to forward reconciliation nationally and internationally. So the ABC decided that we want to start embedding Indigenous language into the everyday conversation. So we are slowly but surely, if you see our NAIDOC tiles that are up on TV, it's all in language from all around the country, and our radio stations are using idents. We've got 130 idents in language. We're doing language lessons for all our presenters. We're doing 65 from around the country and embedding language also. I think I saw on the question, somebody said that they've been noticing that Gardening Australia is using place names. So that's the other thing that we're trying to do, is use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander place names when we're reporting from places. We're also trying to, we're also putting on the back of the screen of the 7 p.m. news, acknowledgement to country. So soon you'll see in Sydney, it'll be acknowledging Gadigal. We've already got one in the ACT that acknowledges the Ngunnawal mob, and the rest of the country is going to be doing that. So we are slowly but surely trying to do that. Yeah, it's good to see that work that's underway, and it's good to see our organisation putting their shoulder behind it and to get that done. A question before we wrap up. So if you had any others, shoot them through. But apologies in advance if we don't get to them. But one from the Pro Vice Chancellor's office. Better answer this one. Well, Philippa, you were both such esteemed alumni and seemed like a perfect fit to do this webinar. Thank you. To finish the UTS Illuminated series during NAIDOC week. Thank you. What important impact do you perceive the other has made in the Indigenous space and the UTS community? The other as in me of Dan? I think that means you of me and vice versa. Do you want to go first, or? Yep. Will I go first? No, I'm going to go first. Okay. I'll throw my bouquet first. So I think Dan is probably maybe the ABC's first political reporter. Is that right? I can't think of anybody else. Stan Grant might have been in our Parliament House Bureau some years ago, but I can't think of anybody apart from possibly Stan, no. Yeah. So I think for me, I mean, besides all the great reporting that Dan does, to have Dan's face on News 24 all the time and see him reporting from Parliament, and knowing that he's an Indigenous colleague and he's coming from Parliament House, he's right amongst it, you know, all day, every day, in the thick of it, and just seeing him there represented on TV, to me, has broken down so many barriers so that other kids can see that and know that there's a place for them. So, I mean, besides all the great work he does anyway, I just think his presence there has been such an impact that, you know, that you can't, I suppose you can't really measure that. So I think for students, you're a great example, Dan, like that they can be journalists if they want to be, you know, I mean, and they don't have to do politics. You've done sport, you've done, you know, you've covered everything, really. You probably love sport more than you do politics, but we won't tell anyone that. Yeah. But yeah, so that's what I think.
Well, speaking, I mean, known you before you started at the ABC, Philippa, and the work that you did with Aboriginal Affairs departments and ATSIC is part of, you know, part of a huge piece that so many people are engaged in, just sort of chipping away on the path towards progress. So that's, but I haven't had the privilege of seeing much of that work, but I have been at the ABC for the entire time that you've been with the organisation, and what was what happened pretty quickly, which I think is sort of setting us up for, you know, hopefully quite a, you know, a brighter future for the organisation, is just how quickly you got more blackfellas in the door. That you know, the numbers, you know, our representation in the ABC's workforce doubled what seemed quite quickly after you came on board, and without you know, without having us around, you can't do much else. So that's, you know, that's the bedrock for a lot of what we're trying to achieve at the organisation, and you got that job done pretty quickly and pretty efficiently and pretty impressively. And you know, if there are people that are seeing my mug on the ABC News channel from Parliament House and thinking that they can, that might be somewhere that they want to go, or seeing pathways within our organisation, well, it's because you brought a lot of those people into the organisation that, that they can have those dreams and aspirations. So I think, credit to you for that, along with everything else.
Thank you.
And on that lovely note, let's wrap up, I think, our webinar at 12:58 for me here in Brisbane, 1:58 if you're in Sydney or elsewhere on the eastern and seaboard. Thank you, Philippa, of course, and thank you for everybody that sent through questions. What a interesting discussion, interesting chat. I've really enjoyed sort of hearing your perspective, Philippa, about how things over time have changed and how they might change going forward from here as well, if the trajectory that we're on continues. So I'll be having a think about a lot of what you've said during this chat. Just a couple of things before we wrap up and the webinar closes. As we mentioned, the session is being recorded as part of the UTS Illuminated webinar series, and it will be available on the UTS Alumni YouTube channel, the UTS Alumni YouTube channel, which I believe is a different channel from the general UTS one. So keep an eye on that, and there'll be a link going out as well. But again, Philippa, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed chatting. A chat we haven't had before in our in the professional context. I'm glad that UTS could bring us together for it. So thank you, Philippa. Thank you for everybody who's joined us on the webinar, and have a great afternoon, or if you're in WA, enjoy the rest of your morning.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, UTS. That was amazing. I've just popped our careers link into the chat, so if we can send it out to all the panelists and send that far and wide. We've got those 8 trainee jobs. Don't forget that. Great way to start and get trained up. And also there's a number of other jobs on our careers site. So just keep looking at that. if you're interested. And there's jobs not just for journalists or on the content side. There's in the support side where I work as well. Legal, finance, you know, human resources, whatever. So just keep looking.
Yeah,
and thanks for having me. That was awesome, Dan. It was so great to talk with you too. And thank you, UTS. Love you guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Philippa. abc.net.au/careers. abc.net.au/careers. I'll take that brownie point and put it in the bank for later, Philippa. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Let's leave it there. But thank you.